Okay, this is lecture 15, Workers of the World, Hope in the East. We've talked about U.S. labor and the class struggles. We've talked about local labor markets and changing employment during the neoliberal era. And today we're going to talk about international labor, and especially about migration, labor competition, and so on. Oh, I forgot. Right, I didn't do a key points. Okay, key points. Well, so there are national labor markets and there are international labor markets in addition to local labor markets. So labor markets occur at all scales. So that's the first point. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll talk about why there's international migration, or migration at all, some of the dynamics of that. And then we'll talk about global labor competition, which is obviously having a huge impact on some workers in the first world, in this country. And then we'll talk about labor struggles and changes that are going on. So that's a fair amount, and as usual, we'll zip through it all lickety-split. Okay, so we'll start with global labor markets, and then why migration, global competition, worldwide struggles. So under the first heading, we have national labor markets, comparative labor systems, and international labor markets. So labor markets are also at the national scale. Because of the importance of the nation state, and the boundaries, national laws, all the things we've talked about before, we know that labor markets form at a national level. That is, people do move around, people do compare jobs, even if they don't move, companies compare, and so on. So most people are working within national labor markets. They go to like national career fairs and so on. And there are even national standards. So all these things tend to level the playing field. Now, of course, I've argued for local labor markets, our regional labor markets. The South is still very different than the Northeast in many ways, the West too. So, we have to look at all these geographic scales. But for simplicity, today we'll just start with the national because we want to work up. And most people don't move. Most people don't migrate, actually. And if they do, they don't migrate very far. They migrate within their regions, within their cities. Now, nations, as a result, have different wage levels that are based on historic development. They're based on historic labor struggles. They're based on the level of national income and also historic levels of development prior to becoming capitalist. So capital can look around, do its Weberian search of the world, looking for good places to invest, good places to put factories, and can see that wages are different. Now, this actually is a consumer price index map, but expensive countries are in green and cheaper countries are in red and really cheap countries. That's a kind of proxy for wage rates. I couldn't find a map of wage rates. I did find here's a typical chart of wage rates. This is in Eastern Europe. You can see they're all quite different, with Slovenia being quite a bit higher than the rest of Eastern Europe. But every country tends to have a wage average. And companies are aware of this. They're aware that Sweden is more expensive than El Salvador, and so on. There also are national standards, which are both cultural standards and are legal standards set by nation states. So we have the National Labor Relations Board in the United States that set and certain kind of national labor laws. Most countries have national labor laws. They're not always observed, but they do exist. And then you have these different forms of labor relations in different, and we've talked about before a little bit, but things like in Germany that unions have a place on the board of many corporations, which they absolutely do not have in this country. And that's an economic and cultural difference. And of course, unions make a huge difference here. And many countries have national unions. They've had them for a long time. And unions do set wage levels. And they can set them across entire countries, trying to set sort of an industrial level for different industries. Now, people have written about comparative labor systems. It was a very popular theme in the 1990s. It's a bit past now. Now we tend to talk just about the rich and the poor, about the coming on of China and East Asia and India, where there's vast differences in wages. But it is an interesting point, and you can see this. Frederick Guy talks about this idea of national capitalisms that I mentioned in part 3 of the course. And there are labor differences that are important in national capitalisms. There really are different national labor systems. And they make countries different, and they make countries not only look different to capital, but enter into international competition differently. So when you talk about national competition between countries, labor systems quickly comes up in the discussion. Oh, well, if you go to France, their workers will be too recalcitrant. Or if you go to Mexico, the workers will be too rebellious, or they'll be too slow, or they'll be too disorganized, or whatever might be the kind of easygoing kind of tropes about national labor. But there are people who try to make this more precise. Some of them are actually contract with capitalist corporations to tell them about labor conditions in different countries and how they're changing. And some are academics. Like David Coates, about 10 years ago, wrote a very nice book on these labor differences, models of capitalism, mostly comparing Europe, Japan, and the United States. That's the classic comparison up until the 2000s when everybody woke up to the fact that maybe they were more than just the triad of the North. In the U.S., just to give you an idea, a feel for this kind of thing, and it's just a feel because these are often stereotyped or they're changing or they only apply to certain core labor markets and core workers. But just to give you an idea of the kind of differences that do come up in the literature, do come up in research about nations, I just take 3 examples: the U.S., France, and Japan. And the U.S. labor system is notorious for being a hire and fire system. Very little stability at work. People expect to be hired and fired. You're already accommodated to that from the time you're very young. Now, especially, it's gotten worse. It's much more like that. It used to be more stable. But this has been a long-standing American habit, even in the golden age of unions and more stable employment. We also tend to hire the young and fire the old first, and that's the opposite of Europe or Japan. We tend to have high wages. We take our money in wages, not in benefits. So many of us work as contractors, as temps. You take a lot of wage, and then you worry about retirement or health care later. And that's why we also have so many people with no health insurance. We work a long year. We work very hard, Americans. We're obsessive workers. We don't take much vacation. We don't have many holidays. We even have this national culture where about 25, 30 years ago, maybe a little more, they consolidated all the President's Days, and also we wouldn't have too many. We used to when I was a kid. We had Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday, 2 different holidays. They could fall on Wednesday, and you didn't have to go to school on a Wednesday. Pretty great. Now they've all been consolidated, so we only have one President's Day, and it always falls on a Monday or a Friday, just to make sure that we don't skive off or take a 4-day weekend or something like that. You get what? For what? President's Day? Well, there you go. Junior colleges are much more in the same places. Yeah. Well, in France, they have this deal where you get a holiday on a Thursday, and then they just have you're supposed to come to work Friday, but they have this thing called a bridge. And a lot of people don't show up on Friday. And they have zillions of these, Saint this day and Saint that day. For Halloween, we don't have a holiday, right? They have 4 days of 2 cents. And I don't know what they have in Mexico. It must be quite a lot. Because All Souls is a very big holiday, right? Isn't it many days? 4 days or something in Mexico? Anybody know? Is it just 2? 2 plus a weekend? Oh, okay. So a 4-day weekend? No? Yes? You're not sure. All right. Well, whatever. We have labor laws that vary a lot because it's a very big country and we have federalism, so we have state labor laws. So labor laws, you can have right-to-work states, as I talked about before, in the South, but not in California. So things vary quite a bit. You can have different laws in terms of gender discrimination, gay partnership rights, that kind of thing, which is a labor law, right? Labor partnership benefits is labor law, and it varies by state. Whereas in Europe, nobody's ever heard of anything like that. It's all national level, I think, in every country. Even a federalist country like Germany, I'm pretty sure it's national. Our union density is pretty low. Germany's is still over 50%. Ours is 10%. And our union power is relatively weak. And the unions are linked politically to the Democratic Party, which is a really bad deal. Because the Democrats are basically the left wing of the capital, of the bourgeoisie, not of labor. Something amusing, I hope. Notice how quickly they look up. See? What are you looking up? Anything you want to share? Okay, tell me. What is it? Any good? Oh, yeah? Cool. All right, well, if you find something interesting, tell me. Oh, no, honestly, I'm not kidding. Okay. Now, the French labor system has much more seniority rights, more stable jobs amongst those middle-aged people who are employed. But they have very high youth unemployment. It's very hard for the young to get jobs. So France in particular, but Europe in general, has really high youth unemployment. And we tend to have high over 50 unemployment. Now, their wage rates are much lower than ours. They have pretty modest wages by and large, but they have terrific benefits. So because they have a national health care, doctors will still come to your house. The only person come to your house now is a fireman, right? And they'll still charge you. You can go to the hospital for a month and they don't charge you a thing. It's just understood. You can be a foreigner and get sick and they don't charge you anything. Okay, they have a shorter work year with more holidays and longer vacations. Though I will say that may give you the impression they don't work hard, but they actually have a longer work day. Americans tend to work 9 to 5. French tend to work 9 to 7. And it used to be they take these 2-hour lunches, but that's gone. So the work intensification in France is just like here. It's tremendous. They have national labor laws that are quite strong and uniform. They have strong core unions and things like transport that go on strike all the time. And in America, if you go on strike, everybody hates you. Park goes on strike, everybody, I got to get to work, right? But in France, a lot of people, some complain, and others go, okay, well, that's the way it is. That's life. And they have a socialist party. It's kind of like our Democrats, only better. And they have a lot, but they have lefty parties, which we don't, with strong ties. So there's a communist union, National Labor Federation. It's very strong. And the Japanese labor system is yet again different. Now, for a long time, they had this Nenko, or lifetime employment, in their big corporations. That's breaking down, but we'll still throw it up there because for a long time it was quite a crucial part of their system, at least in the core companies. And a lot of identification with the companies. And we get that. If you're in Silicon Valley, you kind of identify with Silicon Valley. I think if you're at Apple, you really identify. But this was a much more general thing in Japan, with the kind of guys who would dedicate their life, the suits who would dedicate their lives to the corporation, almost never go home at night. Quite an interesting and totalizing culture of work. Again, that's changing. But they also had labor participation on the shop floor much more than we did. Some of that has come over to the U.S., has crept into our system, whereas we were much more Fordist. They did more of these work teams in their major industries. Wages are kind of moderate. Benefits are also kind of moderate. The strike system is very formalized, but there are regular wage increases in the major companies with these kind of annual strikes without a lot of fighting and off-time, downtime. So whereas in the U.S., if you go on strike, it's really a Donnybrook, and it's, it's head-to-head, horn-to-horn for a long time. So again, quite different. Again, these things are changing, but just to give you an idea of how they can be different. International labor markets are yet another thing. There are people who go to work by crossing borders. Some do it every day on the Mexican border, for example. They literally cross over the bridge or whatever checkpoint, wherever they are, and go to work on the other side. But there are others who migrate for longer periods. Some migrate for a season and go back. Some migrate for 2-3 years and go back. And some migrate and stay the rest of their lives. So there's a lot of variations on this theme. And you can see the advanced countries in the north have taken in enormous numbers of immigrants in recent years, while Australia, actually the highest, interestingly enough, although when's this date from? Oh, this is back in 1999, so it may have changed a little bit. Canada and Australia are much higher than the United States. But we tend to be higher than Europe, although Europe has been increasing. So the new global migration is not, the old one in the 19th century was Europe going to the New World mostly, and a bit to South Africa, Australia. And the migration today, of course, is to south to north. This is a nice map of it all. We get Latin Americans mostly and East Asians of various kinds. Filipinos go everywhere. Europe gets mostly people from around the Mediterranean. This does show migration into the Persian Gulf. There's quite a lot of that. And migration from the Central Asian republics up into Russia is quite strong as well. Okay, but most migration is still internal, I guess. Can't repeat that enough. Okay, comparative differences. The U.S. has had the most open system of immigration, although that's been closing down, or they've been trying to close it down recently, much to, I think, our shame. Europe had a much more systematic system of guest workers after World War II for many, many years. Turks going into Germany, Portuguese, and Moroccans into France, and so on. But those migration streams have continued in some cases. In other cases, like Portuguese, have stopped. They went back to Portugal a long time ago, or just stopped coming. Japan is kind of interesting because it has very little migration. Very few foreigners. It has some now. It's beginning to crack open, but it's still pretty small. You can see it down here on this graph, right at the bottom. The EU really zooming in the early 90s, but that had mostly to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then fell down below the U.S. again. So there are those differences. And Filipinos, I just like to point out, are the most mobile people in the world. It's a country with a lot of surplus labor, a lot of problems of development, a very oppressive social relations in many parts of the island, social unrest, and so on. And there's at least 8 million Filipinos abroad, which is a heck of a lot for that country. And they go all over. Plus, they man all the ships of the world. They fly under Liberian flag or Greek flag, but they're almost all, if you go down in the engine rooms, it's all Filipinos. And then women domestics all over East Asia, the Middle East, and so on. So that's a major global labor market, labor flow out of the Philippines. Okay, why do people do this? Why do people leave home and migrate long distances for work? Well, this is a subject that, of course, has got a lot of heat and very little lot of smoke, I should say, very little fire, by and large, in popular discussions, journalistic discussions. So I want to emphasize three things. One is why people are pushed out of rural areas, and secondly, why they're absorbed into industrial and urban areas, and why it moves in cycles. Okay, so the first thing you have to know is that, yes, people are displaced out of agriculture. That's going on all over the world. And, where they're losing their land, they're losing their means of livelihood, there's surplus labor in the countryside, and people leave. They cannot survive, and they leave, and they go somewhere else. And, of course, they are attracted by certain aspects of modern life, although mostly it's about employment, as we'll see. And if we look over time at the history of the world since the British Industrial Revolution, or even before the Industrial Revolution, we see this kind of expanding bow wave of agrarian change around the world. So, and if you look at American immigration in the 19th century, you can see it very clearly. You can see it right to today. That is, the first people to come pouring into the New World are English and Scots. And many of them pushed off the land by the enclosures in Great Britain. When Irish agriculture collapsed with the Free Trade Act in 1844, Irish started pouring out of Ireland into Britain and over to the United States, when you ended up with something like 4 million Irish people coming into the United States. It then also started hitting in southern Germany. We started getting southern Germans. And then in the late 19th century, we started seeing Italians show up, southern Italians, and then a few Greeks and so on. By the early 20th century, Eastern Europeans, Slovaks, Hungarians, Poles, Jews from Poland and Eastern Europe and so on, who had been displaced from the land and came pouring in the U.S. You almost never got a big French migration. Why is that? Because the French peasantry, thanks to the revolution and also to certain things about the social order of France, never left France and the land en masse until after World War II. And at that time, they went to French cities. They didn't come to the U.S. And the rural migration usually goes to cities. The rise of capitalism has been directly associated with the rise of cities. As I've said before, as rural areas are depleted, people migrate to the cities where most of the capitalist activity is, where the biggest chance of finding work and opportunity is. And this has been a universal geographic pattern. And the main migration, and I didn't put this on the slide, which is a mistake. If you talk about global migration since the coming of capitalism, it is overwhelmingly, the mass of it, from country to city, not across borders. It's from country to city within borders. The biggest migrations in the United States are actually out of the American South and Midwest as agriculture collapsed. The great migration of southern whites and blacks that came out from World War I onward to the north and to the west happens because of the collapse of the old agrarian order of sharecropping, small-town, low-return cotton farming in the South, replaced by agribusiness in California, Texas, and Arizona, growing cotton much cheaper, much more efficiently, and with fewer boll weevils. And people left. They went north. They went west. And that is just happening again and again and again. That's kind of a cute little cartoon of China. I kind of like that. Although a lot of them do not end in high-rises. They end up in the world of slums, written about by Mike Davis in Planet of Slums. Okay, so the basic cause of people moving out of the countryside is the transformation of the countryside. It's not baby-making. It's not, and sometimes it's warfare, but mostly, the vast majority, is the transformation of the countryside. And sometimes it's more violent, and sometimes it's more just market effects. But then why do people go to the United States or Europe or Japan, or wherever they're going to migrate? It's because there's labor demand. It's all about labor demand. And so they go, and the pattern's very clear. The long-distance migrants go to where the work is. They're not so much, they're aware, of course, that in these countries there may be a higher wage rate. That the wage rate in the United States is higher than it is in Mexico on average. That the wage rate in Dubai is higher than it is in Bangladesh. And so people are aware of that. But they don't get up and migrate, contrary to economic theory, standard economics, simply in response to a wage difference. Otherwise, everyone in the world would be in the north. Most people don't want to leave home. They don't want to go very far. If they do migrate, it's into their own towns and cities. So why do they end up going long distances? Because there aren't jobs. There isn't a means of livelihood at any wage often, and they know that there are jobs available in the receiving areas. That's why they go. And there have been interesting studies of the United States in the last 30 years of the new migration. And you can see very clearly the pattern, the physical pattern. I should have had a map of this, but physical pattern in which people go, migrants from Mexico or Guatemala or wherever, go to the places where the labor demand is strong. They go to the states that are growing. They do not go to the empty states. So they do not go to the upper Midwest, which has been losing people through all this period of migration from Mexico and so on. People have been migrating out of the upper Midwest, much to the delight of Native Americans, who in some places now outnumber the white people again. They're quite pleased about that. So when they came into California in such numbers in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it's because California was the fastest growing job market, the engine of American growth. That's why we got so many migrants. In the 2000s, they stopped coming to California in such large numbers. Where did they go? They went to places like Georgia and Texas and Illinois, where jobs were going faster than in California. The labor siphon that I'm talking about here, the labor demand, is not just something abstract. It's something that's made concrete to people through information, through knowledge, and through direct recruitment. And there are various ways you can recruit. Employers from the dawn of capitalism have recruited at distance by means of agents, of advertisements. They used to, the meat packers of Chicago, if you read The Jungle, were distributing flyers around Poland and Czechoslovakia